Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. We are pleased to talk with you today and provide an overview of the Florida Mathematics Redesign Institute recap. My name is Carrie Henderson, and I serve as Executive Vice Chancellor for the Florida College System. And I'm joined by my colleague today, Abby Ivy, who's Director of the Student Success Center. For those of you who have been on the periphery of this work, we held a Mathematics Institute last month in Gainesville, where we provided an overview of the recommendations that came out of a year-long effort around mathematics redesign. We have several members of our work group on the call today, and we also have folks who haven't been involved in the work. And so we're really excited to share the recommendations and the process that we followed with a new group of people and get your interest and engagement in the work. Before we begin, just a few logistics from today's webinar. We are going to mute participants for the duration of the webinar. We do have the materials from today's webinar in the handouts pane in GoToWebinar. We have a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, as well as a full copy PDF of the report that we'll be referencing throughout the webinar. We will be answering questions at the end, and so if you have questions about the process, about the recommendations, about next steps, please submit those through the questions pane, and during the Q&A portion of the webinar, we will address the questions. And just to note that we are going to be recording the webinar today and putting it on the Florida College System's YouTube channel. Now I will turn it over to Abby Ivy to walk you through the first part of our discussion this afternoon.
All right, thank you, Dr. Henderson. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Abby Ivy, the Director of the Florida Student Success Center. And up on the screen, you'll see the agenda of what we are going to be discussing today. I'll first provide a brief recap of what happened at the Mathematics Institute on June 27th and the topics that were covered there, and then we're going to move into talking about the recommendations specifically, so how we arrived at those recommendations and then what those recommendations actually are. And then from there, we'll talk about next steps and where we go from here as far as implementing the recommendations. All right. So first on the list is the recap of the actual institute. We kicked off the institute with a panel of students, and that really was one of the highlights of the day. We had students from high school, the Florida College System, the State University System, and even a graduate who's out in the field working now, come and talk with institute participants about their experiences and their successes throughout their mathematics journey. So that kind of set the tone from the day and reminded everybody why we were doing this important work. We also had a panel of experts from New York, Ohio, and Minnesota come and speak about their experiences with math reform. They all have been involved in the Carnegie, Quantway, and Statway work, and they were able to provide some great insight and advice and confirm some of the work that we've been doing in Florida and the recommendations that have come out of this work. So a lot of what they talked about and what they've done in their states really falls in line with what has been discussed in Florida and what's in the recommendations. We also had concurrent session presentations from all of the subgroups that were a part of the mathematics work groups, and we'll get a little more into that later, but this is where work group members who have been deeply involved in this work over the past year were able to do a deep dive into the different math reform efforts and recommendations that they explored as part of their work groups. And then finally, kind of the culmination of the event was the launch of the Mathematics Redesign recommendations. We'll discuss those in detail a little bit later, but we also had a session with two of the work group chairs to really talk about how we got to where we are now. And the slide that's up right now shows you the titles from the concurrent session. So these were all of the different presentations that were given by the work group huddles. And as you can see, they really covered a range of topics, everything from streamlining math, to prerequisites, to learning outcomes, to career inventory. There really were a lot of different topics covered, and it shows that the work group huddles were approaching this math reform and work from all different angles, and we were able to explore all of that at the Institute. So now we are going to talk a little bit about the process of how we arrived at the recommendations for math reform in Florida. So in 2018, the Florida Student Success Center established 3 work groups that would identify current challenges in mathematics pathways and also develop policy and practice recommendations to improve student success in mathematics. So these 3 work groups were charged to explore some of the complex issues surrounding math pathways to help prepare high school students to transition into the Florida college system, and then prepare Florida college system students to then transfer to the state university system. So we had a work group that was focused on the high school to post-secondary transition and looking at, curriculum alignment and transition between high school and college. We had a work group that focused specifically on Florida college system mathematics sequences, looking at those multiple pathways, as well as how we might redesign courses to maximize support for students. And then finally, we had a 3rd work group that focused on that college to university transition and alignment. And we actually had over 90 people volunteer to participate in these work groups, so many that we had to break them out into the sub-working groups that we called huddles that I mentioned earlier. So each huddle was assigned a subtopic that fell under the main work group focus area to explore. And each work group was led by a chair that was either a faculty member or administrator, and also they were supported by staff liaisons within the Department of Education and the Office of the Board of Governors. So then how the process that the work groups underwent to actually arrive at the recommendations, the center developed a toolkit to guide the mathematics pathways redesign and content alignment. So it was actually modeled after the Dana Center's Mathematics Pathways State Reform Toolkit, but customized to fit the Florida work. And it really provided step-by-step instructions to the work group members that resulted ultimately in the creation of these policy and practice recommendations. So the work groups first came together in September of 2018 to really launch the work, and they started with identifying and prioritizing the challenges that they encounter related to implementing math pathways. And then from there, they continued to work together through webinars and another face-to-face convening where after they identified the challenges, they brainstormed the solutions and ultimately developed the recommendations that Dr. Henderson is going to talk about in a moment.
Yeah, and I would add, I think a really important piece of the work that happened was really beginning, as Abby said, with identifying what the problem is and what the challenge was. Oftentimes in higher education, we're really quick to jump to solutions and jump to the recommendations. And so it was really important before we did that to begin by looking at data, looking at the systems and structures we have in place around mathematics and pathways for students, and identifying what those challenges were, looking at our assumptions and trying to kind of triangulate and make sure that we were focusing on the right challenges. And I think that led to much stronger recommendations in the solutions that you'll see in just a few minutes.
Definitely, and I think it's also important to point out that the Student Success Center and the Division of Florida Colleges, we serve as a convener and a resource along with our colleagues in the K-12 system and the Board of Governors office. But this really was a faculty-led, faculty-driven initiative. The work group members, they're the ones who dove in, did the work, identified the problems, and came up with a solution. So I think that's something that's really important to point out. So with that, I will pass it back over to Dr. Henderson to talk about the actual recommendations that came from the work.
Great, thank you, Abby. So on your screen and in your handouts pane, you actually have a copy of the full recommendations that does a deep dive, not only in the process that we took that Abby summarized to get where we are, but it provides implementation strategies and considerations for states, for institutions, for individual instructors to consider as we look at mathematics redesign and content alignment. When we began this work, we knew we wanted to get to a place where we were able to talk about policy and practice recommendations, and it really was an iterative, organic process that resulted in how we're grouping sort of 3 recommendation categories. The first is a statewide policy level category, and when it comes to statewide policy, we know we're looking at far-reaching results that can have impact at scale. So these are recommendations that could be related to statutory revisions, so a change in law that would require legislative approval. It could be change in policy around State Board of Education rule that requires the State Board of Education to make revisions, and it could also be related to policy around things like the Common Course Numbering System or the Common Prerequisites Manual. So policies that are managed and have a far-reaching impact at a statewide level that may take longer to enact, but can have longer-reaching results at scale. And so in thinking about prioritizing the recommendations, keeping in mind that state policy is something that can have a really breadth and depth of work, but it can also take a little bit of time to get there. And it requires different levels of approval when it comes to depending on the type of policy you're looking to change. The second type of recommendation that you'll see within the document is institutional policy. And so we've grouped them sort of into 2 categories. One is intra-institutional policy. So that refers to policies that exist within one college or within one university, within one district. So policies around textbook adoption or policies around course level prerequisites required for higher level mathematics courses. So the intra-institutional policies are things that require and consider things around department chair recommendations. It could require a provost approval or a cabinet level approval, or the institutional policy could be something that the district boards of trustees are responsible for. We also noted that there is inter-institutional policy, and the way that our systems work together from the K-12 system serving into the Florida College system, and then the Florida College system serving into the university system, we have a very clear pipeline for students from a statutory perspective. And so when it comes to actual implementation, there may be things that we can do between institutions, so between a district or between a school that can help students move along in their mathematics pathways to be more successful. So when we talk about institutional policy, we're thinking about both policy that occurs within one institution as well as policies that span institutions and might span systems as well. And then the third area that emerged as recommendations are around practice. So this could refer to instruction, actions, or activities that produce some sort of desired results. And so practices can be institutional or they can be individual. So something that can happen within a classroom or something that can happen within an institution. And so I think a good example of ways to think about this from a statewide policy perspective, one might be that there is a statute that governs textbook affordability and textbook adoption. Institutions are also required to have their own policies around course textbook adoption. And then many institutions also have practices around textbook adoption, things like implementation of OER or things like bulk purchase of textbooks. So we really wanted to be sure that the recommendations that came out of the work group were able to address all levels of policy and practice. So let's dive into some of the key themes that emerged. We had, as Abby said, a number of subgroups working on recommendations. So we had 14 subgroups and had several dozen of the recommendations that came out. And so part of what we did in the latter part of our work was trying to look for key themes. What are the commonalities on recommendations? And what we were really delighted to see was a lot of consistency in the recommendations that emerged from groups that might have only worked together or had conversations once or twice. So it was really affirming to see so many of the recommendations be consistent across all of the different work groups. I think the primary theme that you'll see when you read the recommendations, and the one that emerged most, was creating mathematics pathways. So this has a number of definitions. For our purposes, it's looking at aligning math courses to educational and career pathways and identifying the appropriate course sequencing and curriculum mapping for those pathways. And so we'll talk a little bit more about how that's operationalized, but I think fundamentally that was the primary recommendation that emerged. The second one was around redesign, and this really was looking at redesigning curriculum, redesigning courses, redesigning instructional methods. And so we've done a lot of work in the wake of Senate Bill 1720. A lot of instructional strategies have emerged, and I think what you'll find is there is a desire to continue to experiment with other strategies and look for ways to improve the way that courses are taught and the way that students learn. We also had a number of recommendations around advising and around counseling. And it was neat to see a group of faculty really engaging in conversation about the student experience and what a student at a high school or a student entering a state college might experience when it comes to deciding what math courses they take. And so we saw a lot of consistency in recommendations around how can we make sure students are advised and placed in the right courses and on the right pathway depending on what their goals are. We saw a lot of recommendations emerge around student learning and examining institutional student learning outcomes for alignment with the statewide student learning outcomes that are identified through the Common Course Numbering System, recommendations around prerequisite courses and what's actually required before a student can enroll in a course, and then looking at innovative pedagogical practices to support students. So how can we ensure that there's consistency in what's being taught within an institution and across institutions, given that our courses do share common learning outcomes? And how can we look at more consistency in prerequisites? And something we found in this process was that there are common prerequisites as denoted in the manual, but oftentimes there's a lot of variation in course level prerequisites when it comes to mathematics, and that could lead to confusion for some students. So many recommendations around professional development, opportunities to support instructors, to support advisors, and a number of areas. Active learning was one that emerged, critical thinking, problem solving. So really thinking about how can we ensure that students are equipped with the resources that they need to be successful, and making sure that our instructors, our advisors are being given the tools to help them get there. And then lastly, and importantly, is around communication and engagement. And communicating with stakeholders both within an institution, so having conversations between advisors and between faculty members about math curriculum, about placement, but also looking outside an institution and thinking about connecting, if you're at a college, with your high school partners and with your university partners as well. So those are sort of the overall themes that when you read the document, I think you'll see a lot of commonality there. We did have 11 total recommendations. We had 5 in the area of policy. And so some of these toward the top are statewide policy recommendations. So one that would require either an articulating coordinating committee, the State Board of Education, or a legislative change in order to work toward them. And then some of the recommendations are institutional policy recommendations, so things that could be done at a state level, but could also be decisions that happen locally within an institution. And so the first recommendation looks at creating common mathematics pathways for students. And we've already talked about that alignment between the students or the math that students are required to take depending on what their career is, what their program of study is, or what their meta major is. And we looked a lot at what other states have done around alternative pathways to college algebra. We obviously within the system have had statistics as a pathway for some time now, and what we found through the process is there's a lot of fear about putting students in a stat pathway or a liberal arts pathway for fear that if a student changes their major, college algebra is something that would have been helpful earlier in their career. And so while we have pathways for stats and liberal arts mathematics, what we found is those aren't necessarily used consistently, and students aren't necessarily placed on those pathways. So one of the recommendations is looking at creating those common math pathways and aligning the courses to what the student is intending to do and what math is actually needed for their intended vocation or transfer program. We also saw with the second recommendation a use of multiple measures to improve placement, especially in mathematics. And so we do have obviously a statute and a rule related to placement and the common placement tests that students are required to have to place into developmental education and college-bearing courses. What this recommendation would seek to do would be to expand the placement that's required and not just look at an assessment or a test score, but look at things like a high school grade point average or a grade for a course that a student took while they were in high school that could be a predictor of their success in a college level course. And so recognizing that not all students are required currently under the model to be placed into development of education, but for those who are using a multiple measures approach to place them. The third recommendation was around prerequisites and ensuring that the prereqs align with the math pathways, and talked already about a little bit of inconsistency in the course level prerequisites. Some institutions may require MAT 1033 intermediate algebra as a prereq for college algebra and for STA 2023 statistics. Other institutions might not. And so having conversations both institutionally but also on a statewide level about do the prerequisites actually align with what the students intended mathematics is based on their pathway. The fourth recommendation is to revise the statewide learning outcomes for developmental and gateway math courses and identifying the essential mathematical processes that students need in the courses and the outcomes that they need to leave with from those courses. When looking back at the course numbers for some of the more higher enrollment mathematics courses, it has been quite a long time since those learning outcomes at a statewide level have been revisited. And so part of recommendation 4 would be revisiting those to look for ways to identify commonalities and how we're measuring student learning. Recommendation 5 is to encourage colleges and universities to implement instructional models that place students directly into college level math courses that carry gen ed credit. So this isn't necessarily saying to do away with developmental education, but it is suggesting that for some students, a model like the co-requisite model where they're simultaneously enrolled in a developmental and a college credit bearing course or supplemental instruction might be an effective method for students to progress into gateway courses quicker. On the practice side, we had several recommendations, and I think you'll see some commonality here as well. So the first practice recommendation is around creating recurring opportunities for K-20 stakeholders to promote collaboration to strengthen math pathways for students. Florida is unique in our math redesign work that we began including K-12. What we heard from many other states who've begun this work is they started with just the look at post-secondary and then involved K-12 in the discussion. With our work, we have the benefit of partnering with our colleagues in the K-12 system to include folks from the public school system in our discussions. And many of you are probably aware that earlier this year, the governor issued an executive order looking at redefining the standards in a number of different areas in Florida, and mathematics was one of them. And so over the last several months, the department has been working with a number of expert groups across the state to identify new Florida standards in mathematics, both at a K-12 level, elementary and secondary education. And several members of the mathematics work groups that have been part of our work actually served as experts on those expert groups. And so thinking about how we can create those recurring opportunities for stakeholders to have collaboration and to really talk about content alignment. And so looking for opportunities for that. The second recommendation around practice is determining the K-12 standards that align with the post-secondary courses identified for each major or meta-major to inform student course selection in high school. So we're at a really critical turning point with the new standards going to be released very soon. We'll have an opportunity to see those standards. They'll come out in the fall, and think about how we can align the courses that we're teaching at the post-secondary level with the K-12 standards, and also thinking about how students can be informed when they're in high school about what they need to be doing to prepare for college and career. And so really making sure that there is alignment and clarity of communication so that guidance counselors and parents and teachers are aware of mathematics requirements and what they can take that will affect their college going experience. Certainly professional development emerged as opportunities for instructors. Active learning was one really large area, and looking at the data, understanding that it is a way to improve success rates and instructional methods. And there were other suggestions around professional development opportunities. We also saw a recommendation around on-demand foundational mathematical modules for students to access in high school and post-secondary. So recognizing that students might need a refresher before enrolling in a course, or while in a course might want to access additional instructional material that could help them be prepared. And so creating opportunities for students to have access to modules that can help with their knowledge of the subject. Recommendation 10 is to increase the availability of advising resources and enlist the help of faculty where appropriate. We had a lot of discussions in the work groups, and several of our work groups actually reached out to advisors at their own institutions to talk about what resources do they have, what information would be helpful to them, what types of questions are students asking, and really came to a conclusion here with this recommendation that advisors need more resources and play a huge role in the student experience and student selection of courses. We did have faculty recognize, even when there is unionization at an institution, that there are mathematics faculty who might be willing to volunteer their time to assist with advising. And so institutions can consider that as a practice, as a way to ensure that students are getting access to faculty members who are passionate about the topic and also can help place them in the right sequence and the right pathway. And then lastly, ensuring that parents and guardians are informed of how to support and advise high school students in a math sequences aligned with the student's college and career pathway. And so really at the high school level, beginning to have students thinking about what is their potential plan for after they graduate from high school. Are they interested in joining the workforce, joining the military? Are they interested in pursuing a post-secondary education? So not only doing a career assessment, but also once the student has a sense of where they plan to go after they complete high school, ensuring that their parents and guardians are informed of how to support and advise those students. And so those are the 11 recommendations in a nutshell. Within the publication that's in the handouts pane, you'll see a lot more details around some background for those recommendations. So some examples of evidence from other states. You'll also see some links to data and other information that were used to inform them. And most importantly, there are implementation strategies. So as the work groups completed their work and developing the recommendations, they also put considerations. So things that we can think about as we pursue this work on a statewide level, and then things individuals and institutions can think about as they seek to promote this work on a local level. So we are really proud of this work and the work that the mathematics faculty and the administrators who have spent the greater part of a year working on developing these recommendations. And so what our plans are for next steps is the Student Success Center intends to remain as the convener of this work. We think it's of critical importance to Florida's future to continue these discussions about student pathways and student success, especially in the context of the K-20 pipeline. And so we also recognize that we had, close to 90 people across the state serve as members of the work groups, but there are plenty of folks who might not have been aware of the work or might have additional suggestions they want to add. And so this month, we're publishing the recommendations, and we're actually opening a public review period where we're going to be placing the recommendations out on our website and soliciting feedback from the public. So from members at your institutions, starting to think about, do you agree that this recommendation is going to make a dent in student success? Is this something that's feasible to be implemented? What's the priority for implementation? We had 11 recommendations, and part of the work, I think, moving forward is going to be thinking about prioritization and is there a sequence that we should consider when we move into implementation. So to that end, we are going to have a public review period begin toward the end of this month and open through October, recognizing that summer can be a difficult time, and so wanting to allow plenty of time for dialogue at the local level as well as conversation at a statewide level. And so we'll be sending that information out, and members of our work groups are also going to be asked to share information and solicit feedback through a website that we have where all the recommendations will be posted. To guide this work moving forward, we intend to form a steering committee we intend to have equal representation from the Florida college system, the state university system, as well as the K-12 system. And that steering committee really is going to help define what the priority of these recommendations should be. Are some of these more low-hanging fruit? Are there things that are going to require additional resources that might take a little bit longer, but we want to get started on? And so we anticipate that the steering committee, once they review the recommendations and review the feedback, will develop an action plan. So what are the steps that Florida needs to take to begin this work at scale? And we also anticipate that this work will require project teams, so individuals from campuses coming together around these important topics. And so we are really planning for the fall to be an opportunity to build this new structure that we're going to have in place with the steering committee and these project teams, and really looking to the new year to begin the work of implementation. And so as we said earlier, depending on the type of recommendation, the implementation is going to be different. So the process of seeking a state policy change is a little different than developing recommendations around practice. And so that's why we intend to involve as many folks as we can to help plan that work. And so what you can expect from us in terms of next steps, we will be sending out copies of the materials provided today, as well as a video of the webinar that will be on Florida College System's YouTube channel. And then in the next week or so, we will be sending out a toolkit. And that toolkit is going to be an opportunity for folks at our institutions to have this same conversation, but at a much deeper level on your campuses. We think this work is so important and really want to empower you all and members of our work groups to have these discussions and get in the weeds at the local level. So you can expect to hear from us, and we will be keeping this information updated on our website. And so really grateful to all of the members of the work groups who helped make this work possible. We also, with the generosity of both the Helios Education Foundation and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we're able to support the work financially and are grateful to all of you for your interest in the work and your engagement moving forward. With that, we will pause, and if you have any questions for us, feel free to use the chat feature. So we did get a question about how many institutions are looking at a co-requisite model, and that's a really good question. We can tell you based on the department's last developmental education accountability report from 2018, about a half dozen institutions are currently using a co-requisite model for developmental education. We don't have a sense right now of how many are considering it, so that's something that likely will be captured in our 2019 developmental education accountability report, but certainly institutions may be having those discussions at a local level. Got another co-rec question. How many are using a co-rec model for college level courses, i.e. college algebra or liberal arts mathematics? That's not something we actually track. I know that Valencia is one institution that's used it, but that's not something we know yet at the statewide level. But a great question and something that hopefully we can explore as we do an inventory of the different math recommendations. Got a question about the steering committee and who's going to make up the steering committee and what's the size going to be. Really great question. I do think that it will be hopefully representation, faculty, certainly from K-12, Florida college system, state university system. We do anticipate, similar to what we did with these work groups, that staff members from the department will serve as liaisons and sources of information for the steering committee. We are still thinking about size because we want to ensure adequate representation across the state. We'll be sure to note different institutional size and other variations. And so it could be around a dozen people to serve on the steering committee. Again, we're thinking that the steering committee would be sort of the high-level group looking at prioritization, and then hopefully there would be project teams so that the work is going to involve a lot more folks than just those who are on the steering committee. A question about were high school students included in the work group? No, they actually weren't included as a member of the work group, though we did consult with students a couple times throughout the process. As Abby shared earlier, we had a current high school student talk with us at the Institute about his experiences. And then the students who had transitioned from high school to post-secondary also talked a little bit about their experiences. I think as we do this work moving forward, to your point, having a student on the steering committee that is representative of our state and has gone through the experience is maybe a great idea, so that we ensure that the student voice is represented as we do this work. All right, well, seeing no further questions, we do want to wish you well. Be on the lookout for a summary of the material presented on this webinar. We'll send that out via email. And we'll also send you a link to an upcoming webinar we have on the toolkit. So that will be a resource that you can use if you want to take this conversation to you on the local level with colleagues at your institution and in your membership association. So thank you all for the work you do for our students and for our state, and we look forward to connecting with you soon.
Thank you.